This is the land where Jesus lived and died, and where some say he rose from the dead. As a boy growing up in the small town of Nazareth, he tied his sandals and learned a trade like other neighborhood boys. Yet when he became a man, his friends said he walked on water. His critics said he was an imposter. Some said he worked magic by the hand of the devil. Today, the argument goes on, as does the search for the real Jesus on this day of discovery. Jesus of Nazareth, the most controversial man who ever lived. After only 3 years of publicly teaching, Jesus' impact and identity is still in question after almost 2,000 years. Some call him God, others see him as a good man, while others call him a devil. Some have died for their belief in him, others have died for their disbelief. According to the biblical record, eyewitnesses in the first century were also divided in their opinion as to the identity of Jesus.
This is Christian Quarter Road. Represents a part of the old city of Jerusalem today that has history and roots going back to the first century. And what was important about those first century Christians is that they were individuals, they were eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen the life of Jesus come to a surprising close.
According to the New Testament, the surprising close to Jesus' life was his untimely death and reports of his resurrection. This is the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem's old walled city. In first century Israel, many religious leaders rejected Jesus' claim to be the Messiah and didn't accept reports of his resurrection. This is the Muslim quarter in Jerusalem. The religion of Islam developed in the 7th century after Jesus and views him to this day as a holy prophet and even Messiah. But like Jewish neighbors, stop short of believing all that Christians believe about Jesus. Today we'll take another look at the identity of this man who, whether he's loved or hated, has changed the course of history, both by what he said and by what he did.
One of the most fascinating pieces of evidence in analyzing the Gospel's portrait of Jesus is that even those most implacably opposed to him did not attempt to deny the reality of his miracles, particularly the exorcisms, but simply attributed the supernatural power to a different supernatural being than God, namely Satan or the devil.
In the Gospel according to Luke, we read this account of Jesus casting a demon out of a man who could not speak.
And he was casting out a demon, and it was mute. So it was, when the demon had gone out, that the mute man spoke, and the multitudes marveled. But some of them said, "He casts out demons by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons." Luke chapter 11.
After Israel had attributed Jesus' miracles to Satan, they asked him, "If you are the Son of God, perform a miracle that's so incontrovertibly from heaven we can't deny it." And Jesus said, "The only miracle I'll give you is the sign of Jonah, which was his resurrection from the dead."
We actually can learn a lot from Jesus' enemies about how they viewed Jesus' miracles. And the reason I say that is that what people today tend to say is that, well, the miracles, you know, they're hard to believe. They really didn't happen. That's not the approach Jesus' opponents took. And sometimes you best understand an adversary by understanding what position their opponents take with reference to them. What the opponent said was, he's working with supernatural power. He's working from power from beyond. It's just not God. It's Satan. And of course, that's the very issue that the Bible lays out on the table about Jesus. It's often said that Jesus was either a liar, a lunatic, or a Lord. And basically, I think the choice comes down to two things. He's either liar or he's Lord. He claims to be operating from God. If his power comes from somewhere else, he's a liar. But if it comes from God, then you have to take the message that he delivers.
In the Jewish literature known today as the Mishnah and the Talmud and the various traditions that were circulating orally at the time of Jesus, later written down, that still remains the recurring charge that Jesus was a sorcerer who led Israel astray. Plenty of opportunity in a large body of literature to simply deny that Jesus worked miracles, but Jesus' opponents, as far as we know, never attempted to do that.
The religious leaders of Jesus' day did not seem to dispute his ability to perform miracles. What angered them, however, was his claim to be the Messiah and the promised deliverer of Israel. According to the gospel accounts, Jesus made many shocking statements concerning his identity.
Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. I and my Father are one." Jesus said, "He who has seen me has seen the Father. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live." Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me."
During this brief period of Jesus' 3 years of public life, the concerns of the religious leaders increased over his claims. While at the same time, there was a growing love for Jesus by the common people. This unfolding drama led up to one final week of world-changing events in the city of Jerusalem.
Putting together the information from all four Gospels, one of the most public dimensions of Jesus' ministry was the last week of his life, entrance into Jerusalem, acclaimed as the Messiah by throngs of Passover pilgrims, teaching in the temple for 1 or 2 days with the largest crowds that ever assembled in Jerusalem that last week of his life. His arrest occurred in a more private context at night as he was praying with his closest followers in the Garden of Gethsemane, although we are told that both Jewish and Roman authorities appeared with a sizable band of soldiers in case his disciples were prepared to fight and resist arrest.
According to the gospel records, the religious leaders of Israel had come up with a plan. Sensing the popularity Jesus was gaining on the street, they knew that they were more likely to get support for their cause from the occupying Roman government. These Jewish religious leaders knew that they could get the attention of Rome if they positioned Jesus as one who, by his claims to be Messiah, was presenting himself as a rival king to the Caesar.
This the Jewish leadership took and made into a political charge before Pilate, because Pilate could have cared less about what Jesus' and the Jews' religious beliefs were about the Messiah, as long as it didn't have political ramifications for Rome. And so when they took this charge from the Jewish examination of Jesus to the trial before Pilate, what they did is they turned it into a political charge. He claims to be a king. He claims to be a king instead of Caesar. He says we shouldn't pay taxes. He perverts our customs. Pilate, your job is to take care of Caesar's interests. You better take care of this.
They made accusations and he just stood silent, didn't answer them. But the religious leaders accused him of being a king. And Pilate and Herod accepted the accusation and questioned him as to whether he was a king. So at his trial, it's the question as to whether Jesus was the prophesied Messiah. And they don't bring up his deity on that occasion, but rather his offer of himself as King of Israel.
Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he answered him not one word, so that the governor marveled greatly. Matthew chapter 27.
There would have been a public dimension to the trial before Pilate, the Roman procurator in Judea. Particularly the Gospel of John describes how Pilate would interview Jesus for a period of time and then come back out to the balcony of his palace and call out to the Jewish leaders and the crowds that had assembled there, engaging them in dialogue, and that in part, in responding to their repeated cries for Jesus' crucifixion, finally gave in to him.
The crucifixion of Christ was a public event. It took place in a public place of Roman execution just outside the city wall. Multitudes passed by and witnessed it.
One of the things that is clear is that crucifixion, a Roman form of execution, happened, that Jesus was pronounced dead by the Romans, and they do know whether people are dead or not. They were very, very good at that. The sword that thrust in produced blood and water that was already starting to separate. The burial was made, and we read of women who very carefully looked at the place of the grave. In fact, some of them stayed there. When they came back, in spite of the guard that was there, the government seal that was there, the tomb had been broken open, the stone rolled away, and the body was gone.
The public dimensions of Jesus' death as well as his resurrection have to be accounted for. Not all who saw those events became his followers. Many were in a position to have debunked the early Christian gospel in its infancy and would have had every reason to do so. Could they have credibly, as eyewitnesses, retold the story of Jesus' life and death and resurrection in some other plausible way?
The Roman soldiers went back and tried to explain to the temple guard how it was that, and although they had been replaced every 6 hours, that they had allowed the body to be stolen. They said it was while they were sleeping. But if they were sleeping, how did they know who took it? If they were awake, why didn't they stop the people who were attempting this? Certainly, if the body could have been produced in the time before Pentecost, his enemies would have been delighted to produce it.
So that while the execution was public, the resurrection was broadcast. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that resurrected Christ was seen by the 10, by the 11, by 2 on the Emmaus Road, by 500 brethren at once. Peter preached it in Acts 2, and thousands accepted the testimony, again in Acts 3. And all through the book of Acts, while the apostles preached the death of Christ, they focused attention on the resurrection, because the resurrection was the climactic witness to who Jesus Christ is.
And so the events of the final week of Jesus' life, his death and reported resurrection, became the core of the message the New Testament calls the good news, or the gospel. It is this gospel the Apostle Paul describes in a letter to new followers of Jesus in Corinth, Greece.
The Apostle Paul wrote, "Moreover, brethren, I declare to you the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, and in which you stand, by which also you are saved. For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then last of all, he was seen by me also." 1 Corinthians chapter 15.
claim for the supernatural doesn't lead to a rejection of the account, because you're still left in the position of having to explain what you have in the historical record in a way that's plausible.
It's fairly common to hear critical scholars who are intent really upon refashioning Christianity to refer to something like the resurrection as a metaphor. And it's a metaphor for the fact that although Jesus was crucified and he was placed maybe in a tomb, he was never raised physically from the dead, but rather his followers, after a period of time, were so convinced that his vision was a good vision for Judaism to now lay claim to, that in their minds Jesus is raised. And so resurrection is really a metaphor. It's not a literal bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead.
We have to be able to explain the change in the direction of the lives of people, the way in which they held together after their hopes seemingly were dashed when Jesus was crucified. Now, if they really believed that Jesus was crucified, and if they really thought he was still in the grave, they never would have given his life for a belief in proclaiming the resurrection. Something changed them from being disappointed and dejected on the day when Jesus hung on the cross to being bold and confrontive afterwards, even to the point of being willing to risk their lives. And a historian has to explain that difference, which is a fact in the record that doesn't require any supernaturalness in and of itself. They still have to explain that part of the record in order to explain the record. And to posit anything else other than a resurrection, or at least a belief that a resurrection took place, can't explain the difference.
We can't say with the same amount of certainty everything that happened to each of the 12 apostles, but there is a recurring trend throughout that subsequent literature, some of which at least comes from very good historical sources, that most, if not all, of the 12 apostles, save John, the son of Zebedee, and Judas, who had hanged himself for betraying Christ even before Christ's death, did give their lives as martyrs for their Christian faith, and did so not as many religious fanatics and martyrs do today, believing in some religion that they are unable to evaluate the truth claims involved, but giving their lives for someone who they had proclaimed was resurrected from the dead, and were in a position to know if that claim was false or fabricated.
There are places of the study of the historical Jesus where skeptics have trouble. And probably the biggest point of trouble that they have is explaining the early church. Where the early church came from, why they were so bold, why they were willing to give their life, how that happened. How could 12 untrained, mostly, of course it was 11 by the time Jesus died because we lost Judas, but how could 11 largely untrained group of disciples launch a worldwide movement in the way that they did? And the only explanation, not just the best explanation, is that something significant happened that changed their lives. And if we ask what that significant thing is, the only credible explanation is the resurrection.
It is this claim for the resurrection that is described in the change of one disciple called Thomas the Doubter.
Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, Peace to you. Then he said to Thomas, Reach your finger here, and look at my hands, and reach your hand here, and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, My Lord and my God. John chapter 20.
According to the gospel record, all of Jesus' disciples were doubters until they reported to have seen him after his resurrection.
Virtually every step of the way is met with skepticism. You've got to be kidding. Jesus raised from the dead? I won't believe it until I see the holes in His hands. Women talking about Jesus being raised? No way. That's an idle fairy tale. Every step of the way they're as skeptical as can be. And the text is almost embarrassingly honest about the fact that they didn't believe it initially. They had to be convinced. Well, something convinced them. What was it? The short answer is resurrection.
One of the most striking elements about the gospel record that critical scholars have to come to grips with, if they're truly going to be objective, is how these committed Jewish followers of Jesus moved from seeing Him as a very important man, a deliverer, a Messiah, to now be understood to be the God-man. We have to remember that the number one distinctive of Judaism in distinction from the religions of the day was monotheism. The Shema that they repeated daily, behold, the Lord our God is one God, was the distinctive that marked them off. And now increasingly what Jesus' followers are recognizing is that Jesus is speaking of His Father, God the Father in heaven, and is alluding to Himself as God the Son here on earth. That must have sounded strikingly like polytheism. But rather what Jesus was then going to drive them to understand is that the Father and I are one, as it is recorded in John's Gospel. So that is probably the hugest theological paradigm shift in human history, to move from a monotheism that denies polytheism, that there is one God, but now we understand that there are three personal distinctions of God the Father, Son, and Spirit. And objective scholarship must take into account that huge theological paradigm shift.
Well, I think we have to see that the advent of Jesus has changed the world. The Roman Empire changes, hospitals rise, scholarly institutions arise, there are orphanages, there is every kind, agriculture, for instance, is going to be promoted by, during the Dark Ages, by monasteries. In all kinds of ways, people are going to be fanning out, bringing the good news of Jesus. Certainly something happens that makes a tremendous impact all over the world.
If I were to offer you $1 million, you would be delighted at that initial offer. But then you would immediately ask, are you able to fulfill what you offer? And if you check my bank account, you would soon discover that that was an empty offer. If Jesus Christ offers pardon for sin, offers the gift of eternal salvation, offers the gift of eternal life, you want to know whether He is qualified to make that offer. And the only one who can make an offer such as that is God Himself. And since Jesus Christ is God, His offer of all these spiritual benefits must be considered a genuine offer. And that's why John, in writing to his spiritual children, said that one must accept the fact that Jesus Christ is God who has come in the flesh.
I was raised in liberal type churches that denied the resurrection, that said there certainly was no flood, there certainly no Adam and Eve, and there certainly was no resurrection. And to me, then, if none of that was accurate or real, then I don't need religion. So I was allowed to leave the church when I was in high school by my mom. But over the years, as I came under, well, a lot of personal difficulties, and I was looking for reality and truth, I began reading the Bible, and I was encouraged, read it like any other book of history, and try to see who Jesus claimed to be Himself. And that really was the most important element for me, to just simply listen to Jesus, see what He did, and then I went about it in an academic way as well, to say, can we see that the Bible records are accurate? And once I saw that they could be trusted, then my whole world was turned upside down when I began to see and understand Jesus for who he truly claimed himself to be.
And as we read those words together, it becomes apparent that the issue cannot be merely whether Jesus was a wise man or a good man or an effective teacher. The issue is whether or not Jesus walked on water, whether he healed crippled people in the presence of witnesses, whether or not he rose from the dead to prove that he was who he said he was, and that he had come to do for us what we could never do for ourselves.